Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into a crucial slice of history. British imperial and colonial policy, looking roughly at the period between 1857 and 1914.
Mm,
We've gathered quite a few historical accounts to try and, understand what was driving British expansion then and what the consequences were.
right.
We'll be paying close attention to India and Egypt, but also looking at the bigger picture, how Britain governed its colonies generally, its native policies, and its place in the world.
Yeah, the goal is really to unpack the strategies, isn't it? To see what stayed the same, the continuities, and what really shifted the big changes in how Britain approached its empire during this time.
Exactly.
And we've got some great sources to work with. Accounts covering India and Egypt up to the First World War, stuff on the shift from the East India Company to the Crown, the Raj itself.
And also looking wider at international relations, that big economic depression in the late 19th century, the scramble for
And
Africa.
then even the idea of the informal empire. So lots of different angles to help us get a hopefully quite a nuanced picture.
Okay, let's start in India then. A moment of huge upheaval. 1857, the Indian Mutiny. Before that, it was all about the East India Company, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And it's easy to just think trading company, but by the early 1800s, well, they had this enormous private army.
Huge. Yeah. Bigger than the actual British Army, apparently. 250,000 soldiers?
Something like that, yes. It had basically become this sort of quasi-government, filling the gap left by the fading Mughal Empire across huge parts of India.
So it wasn't just about tea and spices anymore.
Not for a long time. The original charter back in 1600 was about trade monopoly, sure. But over the centuries, it just kept pushing militarily, politically. Profit was the driver, but it paved the way for formal empire.
And the mutiny in 1857 really brought things to a head.
It was the catalyst, yeah. Caused by, well, a mix of things. Those infamous rifle cartridges greased with animal fat, which offended both Hindus and Muslims, but also this growing discontent, nationalist feelings bubbling up.
And it was a serious challenge.
Oh, definitely. The company lost control of about a sixth of India for a while. It took them a whole year to put the rebellion down.
Which must have sent shockwaves back in London.
Absolutely. And that led to a massive change. 1858, the end of the East India Company, the Crown steps in, takes direct control.
But, and this seems key, did the underlying economic situation change? Was India still being exploited?
That's the crucial continuity. The administration changed, but the economic relationship, pretty much the same. You look at the railways, great for Britain, built with British money.
And the tariffs, you mentioned those.
Exactly. Zero tariffs on British goods coming into India. But if India wanted to sell to, say, the U.S., suddenly a 20% tariff, it's clear who that system benefited.
So the British Raj is established, we get a viceroy, Queen Victoria becomes Empress of India later on.
Yeah.
But economically, it's still very much a colony.
Precisely. You had this relatively small group of British officials holding immense power, often looking down on Indian society. The structure changed, but the core economic function for Britain remained.
And what about the Indian Army after the mutiny? How did they manage that?
Ah, that's fascinating. The absolute priority became preventing another mutiny. That was the focus.
How do they do it?
Well, several things. British officers only, in the top ranks, deliberately mixing regiments, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, all together in the same units to stop them uniting.
Divide and rule again.
Classic divide and rule. And they started favoring certain groups for recruitment, like Gurkhas and Sikhs, seen as more loyal or martial. Crucially, the British kept tight control of all the heavy artillery.
And use these troops elsewhere.
Yep. Indian soldiers popped up all over the empire. Egypt in 1882 is a good example. India's resources, including its soldiers, were plugged into the wider imperial machine.
It's quite a calculated system of control.
Extremely calculated. They knew the army's potential power and designed everything to minimize the risk, even infrastructure like the railways.
You mentioned them being good for Britain.
Yes, they looked like modernization, and in a way they were. First tram in Calcutta, thousands of miles of railway track built by companies like the Great Indian Peninsula Railway.
Sounds impressive.
It was, but who paid for it? British private investors. Who got the contracts for building them, for the steel, the engines? British companies. So yes, infrastructure, but serving British economic interests first and foremost, facilitating getting raw materials out and British goods in.
Okay, so let's move forward a bit, say 1890 to 1914. What were the main goals in India then? Did things shift?
Well, the main goal, according to the sources, stayed pretty consistent. A real continuity there. Keep control, maintain stability. That fear of another mutiny was always lurking.
Any changes, though?
Some limited ones. Education expanded slightly, but, literacy was still incredibly low, under 6% by 1911.
Yeah.
And the continuity of using Indian labor and soldiers elsewhere, like in Uganda, that carried on.
And the divide and rule tactic.
Oh, yes, that continuity was alive and well. Still emphasizing caste, religion, anything to stop a unified national identity forming, trying to keep that gap between the Western-educated elite and the rural masses.
Cynical, but effective, I suppose?
From their perspective, yes. But it wasn't entirely successful because you do see a definite change, the rise of organized Indian political groups.
Like the Indian National Congress.
Exactly, formed in 1885, starting to demand more, say, eventually self-rule, and other groups too, like the Servants of India Society, pushing for social reforms, tackling caste issues. So Indian voices were organizing.
And how did the British react to that? What about someone like Viceroy Curzon?
Curzon, 1899 and 1805, definitely tried to tighten the reins. His reforms were aimed at strengthening British control, things like the Imperial Cadet Corps, creating the Northwest Frontier Province, reforming the police and universities, bringing in the gold standard.
So modernization, but on British terms.
That's the continuity, really. Yes, some administrative changes, but it was all top-down, designed to make British rule more efficient and secure, not really to empower Indians.
Then came the partition of Bengal in 1905. That caused uproar, didn't it?
Huge uproar. Officially, Curzon said it was just for administrative efficiency to divide Bengal into a Muslim-majority east and a Hindu-majority west. But Hindus especially saw it as a deliberate move to weaken their influence.
And the reaction.
Massive protests, boycotts of British goods. It was a real step up in nationalist feeling, a significant change in the scale of opposition, so much so that they actually had to reverse the partition in 1911.
Which shows a continuity too, perhaps.
Yeah.
That ignoring Indian opinion could seriously backfire.
Definitely. And the partition had another consequence, another change. The Muslim response was different.
How so?
While many Muslims were uncertain, some leaders saw potential advantages in a Muslim-majority province. This led to the formation of the All India Muslim League in 1906, specifically to look after Muslim interests. Sometimes they even supported the partition.
So it deepened the religious divide.
Tragically, yes. A change that set the stage for future problems. And you can see again how Britain's divide and rule continuity was shaping how politics developed.
After all that turmoil, we get the Morley-Minto reforms in 1909. What were they about?
They brought in a small number of elected Indians onto legislative councils, 27 on the Viceroy's Council, about 135 across the provinces by 1910.
A step towards democracy.
A change.
A very small step. It's often called that, yes, a change. But the crucial continuity was that real power, still firmly in British hands. More symbolic than substantive, really.
And that continued under the next Viceroy, Hardinge.
Pretty much. Moving the capital from Calcutta to Delhi in 1911, partly seen as a move to undermine Hindu nationalists in Bengal, another continuity in trying to manage Indian politics.
And then, 1914, war. And Hardinge declares war on Germany on India's behalf, no consultation, just announced. That really underlines the continuity, doesn't it? India treated as a possession. Although the war itself, that did open up a potential change down the line, giving India more bargaining power, perhaps, because of its contribution.
Okay, let's pivot to Egypt. Roughly the same period, 1882 to 1914. Control was the aim there too, but it sounds like a more complicated setup.
It was. A key continuity was that it wasn't straightforward direct rule like India was becoming. Britain occupied Egypt militarily in 1882, but technically Egypt remained part of the Ottoman Empire.
So Britain had limits on its power.
Yes, legal limits. British officials had to deal with the capitulations, these old agreements giving Europeans special legal status, exempting them from local laws in many cases. Plus, they had to navigate Islamic law and international treaties, so British influence was often more indirect, behind the scenes. That was a constant constraint, a continuity of sorts.
But they still made significant changes. Baring's economic reforms.
Oh, absolutely. That was a major change. Lord Cromer Baring basically took charge of Egypt's finances. The stated reason was paying off European debts, and half of Egypt's taxes went to that.
Half, wow.
Yeah. But he also improved farming methods, oversaw the building of the Aswan Dam in 1902, which hugely boosted cotton and sugar output, and promoted British tourism, too. So Egypt had an elected parliament on paper, but British advisors held the real power. The continuity was the focus on financial control and keeping the Suez Canal safe for Britain.
And the military presence grew.
It did another change. Over 5,000 more British troops were integrated. But more troops meant more friction. The Denshawi incident in 1906, that really lit a fire under Egyptian nationalism.
What happened there?
A dispute between British officers pigeon shooting and some villagers. It escalated, an officer died indirectly, and the British response was incredibly harsh. Public hangings, floggings. It caused outrage, a real change in the intensity of anti-British feeling. It led to Baring resigning. Gorst took over, tried putting more Egyptians in government roles, but also clamped down harder on the press. A bit of a mixed change.
Did nationalism keep growing?
Yes, that was a continuity. Leaders like Mustafa Kemal Pasha were very critical, though it's interesting. The upper classes often did quite well under the British and were sometimes supportive. But then came the big change, 1914.
War again.
War again. Kitchener was in charge by then, tightening control already. Britain used the outbreak of war with the Ottoman Empire as the moment to declare Egypt a formal British protectorate. They kicked out the Ottoman-linked Khedive, put in someone pro-British. A definite shift from informal occupation to formal control. That was a major change.
So looking across the whole empire, was there any consistent native policy?
You know, the sources really stress the continuity of, well, inconsistency. There wasn't one fixed policy. It really depended on the place, the people, British interests.
So pragmatic rather than principled.
Very pragmatic. Sometimes cooperation with local leaders, sometimes displacing people entirely, sometimes playing groups off against each other that divide and rule continuity again. It was reactive, really.
But there was a difference with settler colonies.
Ah, yes, that's a noticeable change. Colonies with large white populations, Australia, New Zealand, that got increasing self-government. Dominion status came in the early 1900s.
Why the difference?
They were seen almost as extensions of Britain itself, rewarded with autonomy, expected to be loyal partners like Australia, helping fund the Royal Navy. A definite shift towards partnership, not just direct rule.
But elsewhere, indirect rule was common.
That was a strong continuity, especially where powerful local rulers already existed. Working through native elites like Sultan Barkash in Zanzibar, cooperating with the British consul John Kirk on ending the slave trade. It was cheaper and often caused less resistance than trying to rule directly.
And divide and rule. You keep mentioning that continuity.
Because it was so common, we saw it in the Indian Army, in Kenya, maybe favoring the Maasai to counter the Kikuyu. The aim was always to prevent a united front against British rule. You see the reaction in things like Harry Thuku's Kikuyu protests in 1922 against taxes and ID cards. Resentment was there, but unity was hard to achieve.
Okay, let's look at the wider world stage now. International relations, 1890 to 1914. Britain's role changed quite a bit here, didn't it? From splendid isolation.
Massively. That isolationism, which had been a policy for a long time, basically had to be abandoned. That was a huge change.
Why?
The rise of rivals in Europe, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy forming the Triple Alliance, then France and Russia getting together. Suddenly, Britain felt quite exposed, so they started making deals.
The Ententes.
Exactly. The Entente Cordiale with France in 1904, then bringing Russia in to form the Triple Entente in 1907, a complete turnaround, joining the European alliance game.
But one thing didn't change. The Navy.
That's a definite continuity. Naval supremacy was non-negotiable. Protecting trade, protecting the empire, the Royal Navy was everything. Britain's global power depended on it, especially with colonies scattered all over the map.
Although the Boer War revealed some weaknesses.
It did, a real shock, actually. And it led to a change. The state of the Army recruits, apparently a third were unfit, often due to poverty. That was a wake-up call.
So it led to reforms.
Social reforms, yes. Things like free school meals introduced in 1906, partly justified on the grounds of needing healthier future soldiers. Army reform itself became a priority, too. Public health moved up the agenda.
And the rivalry with Germany.
That really intensified both continuity in terms of imperial rivalry, but also a change in focus. Germany increasingly replaced France as the main competitor. You saw it in industry, the naval arms race.
Germany building up its fleet.
Yes, challenging Britain's dominance at sea. And imperial clashes, too, like over South Africa. Tensions just kept ratcheting up.
And this eventually changed military priorities.
It did, a significant change after about 1912. With Europe looking increasingly unstable, Britain started pulling naval power back from the empire, concentrating ships in the North Sea closer to Germany. Defense of the empire actually became less of a priority than readiness for a European war, a real shift away from that empire-first thinking.
If we quickly jump back before 1890, say 1857 to 1890, we can see the roots of these rivalries forming.
Oh, absolutely. German unification in 71, its industrial and naval ambitions, that was a long-term challenge brewing. France, after losing to Germany, pushed hard into colonies like Indochina, which inevitably bumped up against British interests in Malaya and Burma.
Britain annexed Burma in response.
Largely, yes. Direct imperial competition in Southeast Asia. And Russia pushing east with the Trans-Siberian Railway was seen as a major threat to India and Central Asia. So the seeds were sown earlier.
It sounds like a pressure cooker building up.
It really was. Everyone jostling for position, resources, strategic advantage. It all fed into the complex web of alliances that eventually led to war.
And what about the economy? You mentioned a depression earlier.
Yes. The Great Depression of the late 19th century, roughly 1873 to 1896, triggered by things like collapsing railway investments, bank failures, it hit globally. Demand fell.
And the response?
Well, one response from the major powers was to look even harder for overseas markets, for resources. Empire expansion started to look like an economic solution. So economic crisis definitely fueled the push for more colonies.
Which brings us to the scramble for Africa.
Exactly, that intense period in the late 19th century. European powers rushing to carve up Africa, driven by economics, yes, but also racist ideas about civilizing Africa and pure treaty competition grab territory before someone else does.
The Brussels Conference in 1876.
Hosted by King Leopold II of Belgium, supposedly about opening up Central Africa, fighting slavery, but really it paved the way for Leopold's horrific personal rule over the Congo.
Horrific is the word. Millions died.
Estimates are around 10 million. Forced labor brutality, all for rubber and ivory. Justified by appalling racist ideas that Africans couldn't manage their own resources. And of course, this kind of thing just increased the rivalry and suspicion between the European powers.
Then the Berlin Conference, 1884-85.
That was Germany trying to bring some order to the chaos to avoid Europeans fighting each other over Africa. They essentially drew lines on a map dividing the continent up. No Africans consulted, of course. Tribal boundaries ignored, sowing seeds for future conflict.
And they set rules for claiming territory?
Yes, the principle of effective occupation. You couldn't just plant a flag, you had to show you were actually administering and defending the territory. This just sped everything up. Africa went from maybe 10% European control in the 1870s to about 90% by the early 1900s. An incredibly rapid takeover.
One last area, the informal empire. What exactly was that?
It's where Britain had significant influence and economic control, but without formal political rule, without making it an official colony.
Like where?
Iran's a good example. Britain controlled the tobacco industry, then got exclusive oil rights through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Or Latin America, huge British investments there, even if less than in India.
And how was this influence maintained?
Often through economic deals, loans, political pressure. But sometimes the Royal Navy was used to enforce agreements, particularly free trade treaties that benefited Britain in places like Peru or Chile. So control didn't always mean planting the Union Jack. Economic power could be just as effective sometimes. Though, as we saw with Egypt, informal influence could easily become the first step towards formal control later on.
Okay, so drawing all these threads together as we wrap up, key continuities seem to be that constant drive for control, especially in India after 1857, the repeated use of divide and rule, and the underlying economic motives that were nearly always present.
Definitely. But also some really significant changes, that fundamental shift from company rule to direct crown rule in India. The change in Europe forcing Britain out of isolation and leading to a reprioritization of military strategy away from empire first. The change from informal influence to formal control, like in Egypt. And critically, the change represented by the rise of organized nationalist movements fighting back against British rule.
It really is a complex picture full of contradictions, which leaves us with a thought, perhaps. Looking at this period, this mix of control, exploitation, shifting strategies, and resistance. What does it really tell us about how power works and what happens when one nation imposes its will on others?
And maybe more importantly for us now, how do the consequences, the echoes of those policies, both the things that stayed the same and the things that changed, how do they still resonate in our world today?
Something for you to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.